So, Vice President Dombrovskis, thank you very much for finding the time to talk to us.
Good afternoon.
Vice President, we understand that EU is planning to provide Ukraine with the second tranche of macroeconomic assistance. The amount we're talking about is €6 million. What is this money going to be provided for? What Ukraine should use it for?
Indeed, during today's summit we were discussing the second tranche of macro-financial assistance to Ukraine of €600 million. This is a macro-financial assistance meant to provide basically the financing for Ukraine's budget. So it's not earmarked to specific purposes, but it's linked with certain reform conditions which reform had to fulfill in order to get the disbursements. We actually made the first disbursement of this macro-financial assistance already last year. And now we're finalizing the work on a second tranche. So pretty much all the conditions which Ukraine had to meet, or all the reform conditions are met. So the remaining outstanding issue is the question of export ban on timber, which is not compatible with deep and comprehensive free trade agreement as agreed between EU and Ukraine. So basically what we are asking is to remove the measures which are not compatible with the agreements which we had reached between the two sides. And today we heard a clear political commitment by President Poroshenko, by the government representatives to work on this issue and also to treat as a priority file in Verkhovna Rada. Some estimates that it can be done still this year, and based on this assumption we can also start preparation of the second tranche, which we then are able to disburse in January.
Mr. Vice President, we understand that there is also another precondition for disbursing the tranche is the access of the IDPs to social security standards. Is this a real precondition, or this is something which Ukraine can work on even after the tranche has been disbursed?
Well, we are working on this, and we had been receiving also lots of information from Ukraine side on internally displaced persons, on reinstatement of pensions and so on, and we see that this work is progressing. In any case, we will continue to monitor this situation, and we'll come back to this issue also in the context of the third tranche of macrofinancial assistance program, because the whole program is actually divided in three tranches, and currently we're talking about the second tranche, but then there's another tranche to go.
And could you elaborate a bit more on these issues with the IDPs, which you see Ukraine currently has? What kind of access to social benefits, social security we're talking here about?
We understand the concerns of Ukrainian side as regards some potential fraud or misuse of resources, but in the case from EU side, we also think, and we actually share this opinion with the Ukrainian side, that it's important that those people which legitimately are entitled to the benefits, to the pensions and so on, are actually receiving them, and so that the remaining backlog of cases is processed in a due time.
If we're talking about the export of timber, the ban which currently exists, how does the Ukrainian government justify that?
As regards export ban on timber, indeed it was introduced, but it's in contradiction with a deep and comprehensive free trade agreement. So from that point of view, what we are saying here that it's important that Ukraine is not unilaterally introducing new trade measures which are contradicting the agreements which we had been reaching, especially in a context that we are also looking at the new ways how from the EU side we can provide some further unilateral access to the EU's market for Ukrainian producers. So we understand it's politically sensitive issue in Ukraine, and also the government is looking on some mitigating measures. But the draft law, which has been prepared by the government now, we had technical consultations with the Commission, also with the DG Trade, which is primarily dealing with trade issues. And what we see is that basically the draft law, as it's prepared now, it's compatible with DCFTA provisions. So if it's adopted, we can then consider this condition met and move ahead with disbursement.
Apart from the export on timber ban and the problems with IDPs, what were the other conditions why the second tranche has been delayed?
Well, there were actually quite a few conditions. There was a question, for example, of the law on energy regulator, which is also one of the remaining conditions, but this law is already adopted and signed by the president, and actually there was also more preconditions which were described in the memorandum of understanding which we had in a context of this macro-financial assistance program. But indeed it must be said that Ukraine had been making a major progress in its reform agenda. So now we are really talking about one outstanding issue which needs to be resolved. And also if you look at the broader macro-financial stabilization issues, we see that Ukraine is finally back to the economic growth. So this year we expect between 1 and 2% growth, next year between 2 and 3% growth. Inflation is down to single digits, budget deficit targets are being met, financial sector is being restructured. So one can say that indeed Ukraine has managed to regain financial stability and return to economic growth, and this is the macro-financial assistance program is actually assisting Ukraine with this process. So we see that those broad targets of the program are being met. Also, Ukraine has resumed the IMF program, which was suspended for some time. So we really see substantial progress in macroeconomic stabilization.
Would you say, you mentioned the resuming of the IMF program, would you say that the EU and IMF are working in conjunction, if you will, and when the IMF sees that Ukraine is fulfilling the reforms, is continuing with the reforms, the EU just basically goes on board? It's true that it's also one of the elements of our macro-financial assistance program that it requires disbursing IMF program. But this is only one of the elements, and we agree on concrete reform agenda, which we describe in the memorandum of understanding, and this is what we are following through. Mr. Vice President, you already mentioned some of the economic reforms which Ukraine has done and the economic growth. But if you could be more specific, what was the main initiator of these reforms? Why did Ukraine basically manage to overcome the economic crisis in some areas?
Well, the main initiator of the reforms were Ukrainian authorities. It's very clear that it's in the best interest of Ukraine to regain financial stability, to return to the economic growth, to ensure competitiveness of Ukraine economy. So from our side we can assist this process with financial assistance, with technical assistance. We can work on deeper integration, deeper cooperation between EU and Ukraine. But I must say that the main driving force of the reform agenda is Ukrainian authorities.
If you allow a question in a broader sense for you as a Vice President for the European Commission, how do you see Ukraine's reforms in general, and in particular the reforms on fighting with corruption?
Well, as regards fight with the corruption, as you know, also during today's summit we were discussing anti-corruption issues, announced new EU support program especially targeted to the anti-corruption measures. And we see that significant progress has been made by establishing of anti-corruption authority, by actually working on anti-corruption cases, by establishing a system of electronic declaration, because this is important transparency requirements that politicians and officials have to declare their incomes and their assets. So we see that significant progress is being made, but of course we see that more needs to be done. It's recognized also by the Ukrainian side, and we are ready to assist the Ukrainian side in the further work in this direction.
Mr. Vice President, Ukrainian government has announced that they're planning to increase the minimum wage by almost more than 100%. Will that impact the assistance EU is planning to provide to the Ukrainian government?
As you know, one of the, or if you want, the broader objectives of this macro-financial assistance programs is macroeconomic stabilization. So there, of course, we understand the reasons of Ukrainian government, what we need to see, what are the budgetary possibilities, how it affects the budget, whether budget deficit stays within limits. So it's there's certainly a possibility to do more on the social side, but of course we also need to see what are the offsetting measures in other part of the budgets or on the revenue side of the budget. So there is a need to maintain a broad fiscal balance. But of course we support the aims of the government to actually improve living standards in Ukraine.
What are the downsides which you see of this step?
Well, once again, it's important to maintain macroeconomic stability, to ensure that budgetary targets are being met, and to see that by announcing new measures, which probably have fiscal impact, there are also some offsetting measures to ensure that budget deficit stays under control.
Understood. Well, many thanks for Mr. Vice President. Thank you very much for finding the time to talk to us. It was a real pleasure. Thank you.